I'm Marcel Wieder, host of The Point. Join me as we chat with Alvin Tedjo, the former Liberal candidate in Oakville North, Burlington, and candidate for the Liberal leadership on The Point. Welcome to The Point. I'm Marcel Wieder. On today's show, we have Alvin Tedjo, the candidate for the Ontario Liberal leadership and former candidate from Oakville North, Burlington. Welcome to the show, Alvin.
Thanks for having me on, Marcel. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
So, Alvin, let's talk first about your background. Give me a little bit of a snapshot of who you are, where you came from.
So I live in Mississauga. I'm there with my wife, who's been a nurse for over 12 years, and we've got 3 kids. 2 boys and a girl. It goes boy, girl, boy. They're 9 years old is the oldest, 7-year-old is my daughter, and I have a 5-year-old son who's in the
A young family.
Yeah, very young family.
And where did you grow up?
I also grew up in Mississauga. My parents were immigrants in the late 70s. They came from Indonesia. They're ethnic Chinese Indonesian. And so we were just celebrating Chinese New Year over the weekend.
All right, I'm going to do a very bad translation of Kung Fei Ha Shoi.
Kung Hei Fat Choi. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. It's, wishing people good fortune.
Exactly.
Yeah, in the new year. So my kids all got to go around and meet their aunts and uncles and do the Kung Hei Fat Choi and
to get the red envelopes?
Get the envelopes full of money. So they were pretty excited about getting the cash. So they were in the car back just counting what they got.
Big bills, hopefully.
Yeah, a few. Yeah. But I mean, you're trying to think of, when you're 9 years old, what can you imagine spending that kind of money on? So
what did you do when you were growing up in Mississauga?
Yeah.
Your parents were new immigrants to this country. How did you get along and integrate into Mississauga society?
Well, I was born here, and it was a pretty diverse community in Mississauga growing up. There were lots of, not just Europeans, but, recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, and lots of Filipinos, lots of Chinese people, some people from the Caribbean. So, I always grew up seeing this huge mosaic around us, and I was always really, it never occurred to me that it wasn't like that everywhere else, right? But no, it was wonderful growing up in that community, and I went to a Catholic school, grew up Catholic, and my wife and I are both Catholic, and our kids now go to a Catholic French school in Mississauga as well. So we're trying to keep those traditions going.
Nice. And you went to university, you went to Queens, so you moved a little bit away from home.
A little bit away, and actually that's where I met my wife. We met at Queens. I did my undergrad there in political science, and since then I've gone and continued my lifelong learning, most notably at Harvard to finish my master's degree. And I'm doing it in digital media design, which is very focused around communications, learning, design, and technology, things like that. So really excited about that. I'm graduating convocating in May. So
well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So you could be adding 2 titles to your name after May.
Yeah, well, hopefully, we want people to come out and get involved in this race. And I think my biggest motivation personally, was making sure that we gave people a reason to vote for the party again, but also to make sure that we were focused on the future, right? Our tagline or our motto for the campaign is "For Our Future," because I really look at my kids and see some issues moving forward with where we are in this province right now, right? There's not enough focus on the environment. There's not enough focus on education. There's not enough focus on where the future economy is going. So the things we've proposed have really tried to address those concerns.
I'd like to delve right into those areas, but first I want to talk about your own Liberal background and how you got involved in the political process and why you chose to become a Liberal.
So it's interesting because I asked my parents as well when I was growing up. I was always curious. I was always interested in politics. we're on the Mayor's Youth Advisory Committee, things like that. I was the Young Citizen of the Year in Mississauga years ago, because I was involved and interested in seeing what was happening and understanding and realizing that in order to change things for the better, you have to be involved and you have to know what's going on. So I asked my parents, who did they support and why did they support them? And my mom always gave me this interesting answer where she talked about how she voted Liberal because when she immigrated to Canada, Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister, and that the programs that the government had to integrate new immigrants were just phenomenal, right? People were taught how to speak English. They had placement programs for employment. They helped people get an education, and that they accepted them as Canadian, even though they just immigrated there, right? And sort of that spirit. And I'm not saying that Conservatives don't share some of that, but I think, my parents felt that it was a uniquely Liberal brand in terms of welcoming people and understanding that we're stronger when we embrace our diversity. So I thought about that, and I agreed with with that sentiment, and I joined the Young Liberals when I was a teenager. Wasn't overly involved, but I participated, went to a couple of meetings, and continued being involved throughout university. And then afterwards, I started working for some advocacy organizations. I worked for the student government when I was in university, and then after I graduated, worked for the umbrella student organization across Ontario, the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. And understanding that working with government, with educated solutions to try and provide actual solutions and not just criticisms of what government does is incredibly important. To be a partner of the government and to work with the government to say, these are the challenges that students face or that institutions face or that these programs are having, and this is what we think we should do. Because I think it's easy to criticize, very easy. But to actually get to the root of the problem and to come up with a solution that works for all sides. Because I think when you're trying to be a champion for something or for a group of people, you need to come up with a solution which essentially is win-win for as many people as you can, right? And that led me to working closer with the government, and after 3 years of working for USA, the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance, I ended up working in the minister's office at training colleges and universities.
And the minister at the time was John Malloy?
Yeah, so I worked for 4 different ministers. I started with Glenn Murray, and then John Malloy, and then Brad Dogood, and then Reza Maridi. And I did communications strategy for the first couple years, and then for the last little bit, I got really into the policy frameworks.
So you got a front row seat in terms of how government reacts to issues and finding those solutions that you just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really exciting to be there when we were developing the 30% off tuition program. We were working on, how do we really address the needs of students? How do we find and fix that gap in terms of post-secondary attainment that we have? Because I think most Ontarians understand that education is our competitive advantage as a province, and that throughout our 15 years in power, we increased the high school graduation rate from 68% to 87%, which is a phenomenal achievement. We're one of the highest in the OECD right now. Our post-secondary attainment rate is really high now too, which means that over 2 out of 3 people in Ontario have a post-secondary education of some kind, a graduate certificate, a university degree, a college diploma, something like that. And that has led to companies coming here and deciding to hire people in Ontario and work in Ontario and set up shop in Ontario, because talent is the most important thing to any company, right? And so I like to use the example of we have Amazon, Google, Facebook. They all have offices in Ontario. They're all paying taxes here in Ontario. They're all, paying very competitive wages. And you contrast that with in the US, where they're not paying any taxes at all, but they're choosing to come here. And we're now, the number 1 jurisdiction in North America for foreign direct investment because we had that talented workforce. So we needed to find a way to see how we could continue that success. How can we get more people who don't participate in post-secondary to participate? And we saw that the demographics essentially showed that the lowest income quartiles don't go to post-secondary because they're debt averse. They can't see the investment past the date that they're going to be in school, and giving those the returns. So the 30% off tuition program, which was the precursor to the free tuition program that we came out with a couple years after that, was all around that idea of getting new people involved in post-secondary, getting more people educated who wouldn't normally get educated, and giving them an opportunity to get that education, which is, we know, the great equalizer.
And what type of success numbers, if you recall, the free tuition have in terms of Ontario?
Most notably, we saw an increase in participation rates among first-generation students and Indigenous students. Two categories of people who didn't traditionally go to post-secondary, right? I mean, first generation, meaning you're the first person in your family to go to college or university. And that's great. That's what we were trying to do. That's who we were trying to reach out to. And I think the important piece of the free tuition program was that most people saw themselves benefiting from it. And unlike some, overly targeted programs, I wish it was more universal, because I think it would have been harder for the Ford government to get rid of after the fact, right? I mean, they've clawed almost all of it back, and they've had over $700 million worth of cuts. And colleges and universities are having a tough time filling some of these programs because there aren't enough students to go, because they can't afford to.
Right. You're obviously a first-generation Ontarian to go to post-secondary education.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my father was a dentist back home, and when he came here, his credentials weren't recognized, which is a big problem for a lot of immigrants.
It's a huge problem for medical or dental or any professional.
He started all over again at Western University. My mom went to Sheridan College, as well as George Brown, to do some work there, to learn some things and get some skills. So education's always been very important to us.
And that's reflected in some of your policies as a candidate for the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think education is a continuum. I mentioned earlier about lifelong learning. And so I want to address the biggest need that we have in the earliest years. And so my wife, Rebecca, and I, we had 3 kids in a span of 4 years, right? They're only 4 years apart. Which meant that we were paying for 2 children to be in daycare for 4 consecutive years. During those 4 years, we were paying $35,000 a year to put 2 kids in daycare. $35,000 a year up front, right? That was
after tax dollars.
That was more than we were paying in our mortgage. That was more than we were paying in tuition when we were in school. And it's just an obscene amount. And I mean, some people will say, well, just don't have kids. Which I don't think is the solution. I think most families try to make it work. And, we had to sit down and seriously think about whether or not it made sense for both of us to work full time. And it did, slightly. But it was tough. Those were tough years. So what we wanted to do, and the first policy proposal that we put forward, we worked with Dr. Cleveland, who was a special advisor to Premier Wynne on the expansion of childcare going into pre-K that we proposed in the last election. We worked with him and a few other economists to have a universal childcare plan that we could implement if we were elected in government. And the idea would be we would continue the expansion into pre-K, and then we would go even further to try and help families from the end of their parental leave, which ends at 18 months, to the beginning of pre-K. So that from 18 months to when you start kindergarten, we would have a space available for you. Now, this would be a plan that would probably take 4 to 8 years to implement, because we have to increase the number of spaces across the province. We have to increase the number of early childhood educators in the province. Those things take a number of years to ramp up. But the economic impact of this is enormous. We're talking about 40,000 jobs being added to the economy, over $6 billion of economic activity being added, $800 million in tax revenue. And
but at what cost? There's a cost attached
obviously, yes,
to that.
There is a cost to that too, but the cost was estimated at about $3.5 billion, which, if you reversed Doug Ford's tax cut, would pay for that immediately. I mean, I think it's all about priorities. Right? And to some people, to most families, this would make a huge difference. On top of the fact that the single greatest thing that you can do to fix the gender wage gap is introduce a universal childcare program.
And talking about universal programs, another one of your policy proposals deals with a universal basic income.
That's right. Because, I mean, the situation right now, there was a Feed Ontario report that came out in October of last year that talked about the cost of poverty. And there's two sides to a basic income, right? The cost of poverty and then sort of the future economy piece that's coming up with AI and automation. But the cost of poverty in Ontario is estimated to be $33 billion a year. $33 billion a year, think about that. Much of that is lost opportunity costs. Much of that is direct healthcare costs. And much of that is cost of the justice system. And I'll walk through each of those really quickly. The healthcare costs. So my wife worked at St. Joseph's Hospital, which is just by High Park, for 10 years. And when she was there, she saw every single night, there would be people coming into the emergency room who, to be honest, didn't need to be there, right? They didn't have anywhere to go. They haven't had anything to eat. They were just poor, right, and didn't have anywhere else to go. So what they're doing is they're using the healthcare system to treat that. They don't need a hospital bed. They don't need a doctor's visit. But that's what they get, right? And we collectively, as taxpayers, as citizens, spend thousands of dollars to address that need. And we're using the healthcare system to pay for the symptoms of poverty as opposed to addressing it head on, right? Even the justice system talks a lot about how every inmate that is in Ontario or in Canada, we spend $60,000 to $150,000 a year to put them there, right? And a lot of those things are caused by their poverty, with the reasons that they're there. So the reason we came up with a basic income proposal is essentially saying, we know that this works. There have been pilot studies around the world and full programs implemented around the world on every continent, even here in Canada. We had one here in Ontario that ran just over a year before Doug Ford canceled it. But more importantly, we had one in Manitoba, which ran for 4 whole years in an entire town in Dauphin, Manitoba. And during those 4 years, there were some incredible things that happened. The hospital visitation, the rate of people going to hospitals went down 8.5%. Could you imagine what that would translate to across an entire province if we had 8.5% fewer hospital visits? The high school graduation rate went up, which increased people's employability, increased their earnings, and boosted the economy. And most surprisingly, crime went down, and the rate of domestic violence over the 4 years went down 44%. That's just unbelievable. So we know what the solutions are. We know how to pay for it. The Parliamentary Budget Office estimated the cost at around $17 billion for Ontario. We would integrate the existing social assistance system here in Canada, or in Ontario, with ODSP and Ontario Works. And that costs about $10 billion. And we could pay for this program through the savings that we would get, through the additional tax revenue that we would get. But the studies are showing that, work doesn't go down. People don't work less because they've got a basic income. What you're doing is you're stabilizing people and you're giving them an opportunity to succeed, whereas normally they would be more of a burden on the system.
So are you saying that this type of basic income proposal that you're suggesting is going to be, in essence, revenue neutral, that there would be enough cost savings in other areas to offset the actual costs?
Well, I think it depends on the rates that you put it at. We want to put it at a rate of $17,000 to start, which is the rate that the pilot was at. Am I going to say that it won't cost any new dollars? No, I don't think it will. No, I'm not going to say that. I think it will cost some new dollars. It could be anywhere in the range of $3 to $6 billion. But again, it's about priorities and what the province decides it wants to manage, right? Do we want to continue funding these other programs that aren't necessarily helping people and keeping them in a cycle of poverty, which a lot of people who are on Ontario Works will tell you, especially before when they used to have 100% clawback for working too much. Our proposal mirrors what the pilot was, that allows people to ramp out of work or ramp out of the program by working more and only clawing back 50 cents on the dollar as they earn more than $17,000 so that they could get out of the program gradually.
So you have a basic income program, you have a universal child care program. the other big issue is healthcare.
Yeah.
What do you have in store for that?
Well, there's a lot around healthcare, and so these things actually address a number of those things as well.
I understand.
Yeah.
There's direct correlations as
absolutely.
you outlined.
So the feed report said that you could save over $4 billion, which I would use to reinvest in the system to make the quality of our healthcare better. And it wouldn't just be savings that we would save it with. I think it's about making sure that we're using the dollars in the right way. But also, there was another study that came out that talked about how the more income secure you are, the healthier you are. Right?
Yes, I saw that study as well.
The more money you have, essentially, the healthier you're going to be over your lifetime. So that's going to have very positive effects. But we have a serious issue around an aging population. And we have a serious issue around technology and modernization right now and hospital visits. And my wife, who, like I said, has been an emergency room nurse for a long time, talks all the time about how we need to improve the system. People need to know better around where they should go and where they can find treatment, right? Doing that means potentially running our system much more efficiently and making sure the resources are used properly, right? A lot of that's on education. A lot of that's making sure that we have doctors, family doctors available to people, specialists available to people. And one of the things that we've proposed already is that we had the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, NOSM, launched a few years ago, which directly targeted northern and rural communities in Ontario. The two schools, or the two sites for the schools, in Sudbury and in Thunder Bay.
Yep.
And there's been great results from that, where the students who are going there are from those communities, and they're studying there, and then they're returning,
staying there.
and they're staying there, returning to their communities. We need to expand that. We need to expand that further, so that the not just for doctors but for other healthcare professionals to work like that across Ontario. And so we proposed a program where communities could identify the needs that they would have in their medical communities, and that they could essentially sponsor their students, where they would identify what they need, and then we would encourage those students to take those programs and then to return to those communities the same way that we do with NOSM. And I think on the side where we are very concerned around seniors and that the bubble of boomers that are aging, is to try and help people transition as best they can to age in place, right? It's not just about beds. Absolutely, we need more beds. We need to invest in that. We need to make sure that it's a commitment. But we also need to help people who choose to live at home and to need more supports there, and to help them transition to living in a different place potentially, or in different conditions while they're at home.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about education, because you feel very strongly on this subject. You have 3 young kids who are all in public Catholic French school.
Yeah.
If I got that right.
Yeah.
And as you pointed out earlier in our chat, one of the competitive advantages for Ontario is having an educated population.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're now seeing labor strife because of the Ford government's proposals, changing the number of teachers that are going to be in the system, putting at risk full-day FDK, full-time daycare, kindergarten.
Yeah.
Sorry. And we're also seeing the reduction of courses available to high school students, et cetera. So take us through some of that and where you feel you would like to take the province if you're a leader of the Liberal Party.
So interestingly, I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear this if they haven't already heard this before. I'd like to merge the Catholic and non-Catholic school boards. And I'll give you a number of reasons for that. But I'm going to sort of work backwards first and talk about the sort of immediacy of this right now because of the labor strike. So before we even came up with this is sort of, I think, is an immediate result because of this, is that there was a study a few years ago that talked about how we could save $1.6 billion a year if we merged the boards. Some of that's been disputed, but either way, I think people acknowledge the fact that there would be some savings. If we had that $1.6 billion, we could right now end the strikes. We could right now give the teachers the the cost of living increase that they're looking for at 2%. We could keep class sizes the way they are. We could not force students to take online courses. All the things we could do it right now if we chose to merge our boards. The reason I wanted to merge the boards, the reason this came up as an issue for us, is not an attack on religious education. Not at all. I see a huge benefit for students, not just my kids, but all kids, from being able to learn from each other. We call the program Learning Together. We celebrate every chance we get the diversity of our province and the diversity of our country. And this is the only place where we've decided to separate people based on religion. Nowhere else do we do this in this province, right? We have Catholic hospitals. They are not exclusive to Catholic doctors or to treating Catholic people, right? Whereas we have a school system right now that is exclusive for Catholics to work in. And for high schools, it is available if you're non-Catholic to go there, but in most elementary schools, it is not. And I think it's time that we move past this idea that we need a separate system. Newfoundland and Labrador in 1997, as well as Quebec in 1997, both moved away from funding separate school systems with the idea that we're stronger together and that what is available in the Catholic system is exclusive. And I want to take what's best from that program, along with what's best from the public program, and have that available to everyone in this province, regardless of their religion, regardless of where they live. Because there are tons of stories that we've heard traveling this province about people who couldn't get to their closest school because they didn't have a baptismal certificate. People who couldn't work at a school because they weren't Catholic, they didn't have a letter signed from a priest. What other government institution has this kind of criteria in order to go there or in order to work there? And I think the goal of every parent is to make sure that their kids are having the best education possible. And so when a parent comes to me and says, I'm worried if we do merge the boards that this, amazing program for my child who has special needs won't be around anymore, I can't access it. And I say to them, what I'm trying to do, what we're hopefully going to do, and what we would do better as a province if we did, is take that program and replicate it and make it available to everyone, have those best practices available to everyone, so we actually truly have the best education system possible.
Now, would you take that proposal and move it a little forward? Because you cited Newfoundland and Labrador as well as Quebec, and there's other provinces that open the door and allow other religions to be part of the
Absolutely.
system.
Yeah. So I went to Catholic school. I went to Father Michael Gates in Mississauga.
Yeah.
And in grade 11, most Catholics will remember this, you take a course called World Religions.
Right.
And it was phenomenal. It was one of the best courses I took because it really taught you and opened your eyes to the religions of the world. But not just that, it opened your eyes to your fellow Canadians, right? You understood better, oh, that person is wearing a Sikh turban, that person is Muslim and they're wearing a hijab. You understood more about your neighbors than you did before you took that, because otherwise before that you were more isolated, right? You were just around Catholics. And so I think it's important that is a principle that we're trying to communicate to everyone, that we should be learning more about each other. I think we have a responsibility to learn more about each other and make that religious education optional. Mm-hmm. So if there are students at your public school who want to learn Judaism or Islam or Hinduism, then get together and do that.
But I'm talking about merging these Christian, Jewish, Muslim school programs into the public and receive public funding, as they do, for example, in Alberta or in Quebec.
Yeah, so Alberta and Saskatchewan and Ontario are the last provinces left that fund separate school boards. The examples that you're giving is not publicly supported right now. They're not publicly funded, and that was John Tory's somewhat proposal in 2007, was to extend separate school funding to the other religious boards. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about funding one public board.
I understand it, but would you be open to bringing those school boards into one public school system?
If they're willing to become a public school that isn't espousing one particular religion, then yes.
Well, it's no different than the Catholics.
Right, except the Catholic system is not the Catholic system is publicly funded. These other schools are not publicly funded.
No, but if they join in, they are under the same criteria from the Ministry of Education that they have to teach calculus and algebra and geography and science, etc. So they have to follow that in order to.
But they couldn't be exclusively a religious school anymore, right? If they wanted to become a public school. Okay,
so you would be okay to having them join if they give up their religious exclusivity to students. So if a Christian student wants to study in a Jewish school, or a Muslim student wants to study in Christian school, that's fine as long as...
Well, they wouldn't be Jewish schools anymore or Islamic schools anymore, right? They would be public schools. And so integrating those private schools into the public system would be...
So this is where I'm trying to understand, having the Catholics as under the public system...
They wouldn't be Catholic schools anymore.
Oh, so
they'd be public schools.
Okay, so they would lose their Catholic flavor, as it were.
That's right.
And they'd
be public schools that would have optional religious education.
So that could be a choice that the student wants to take a religious course. They could do that, and then they get credit for it, just as they would take a chemistry course, for example.
That's right.
Okay, so because I think a lot of people aren't clear in terms of the concept that you're speaking about. So I think this helps
absolutely
frame it a little bit.
No, that's great, Marcel. Thank you for bringing it up. I think as simply as I can put it, we're trying to create one publicly funded system that's not religious, that has optional religious education.
Okay, so...
And one for each language, I should also be specific.
French and
one
English.
For the Catholic English, and one for the French.
And so you're not asking the Catholics to not have religious courses, but those are optional under your system.
Right.
So if you want to send your kids are currently going to a French Catholic school, they could either choose to go to religious study classes or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And we would lift the
restrictions
on teaching.
On teaching. So you could have a Jewish teacher teaching at one of these classes, teaching English or science or whatever.
And I mean, the other thing that we're trying to say is that this isn't going to happen overnight.
Right.
This would be a transition process. I think Quebec took almost 10 years to fully transition out, and some schools kept their names and some schools changed it. It was sort of up to the community. But I think there are bridges to get to that point, right? If right now, as we're transitioning, we can look at how boards could work better together. How do the boards start amalgamating? Because we don't want to force them into spending more money or into reducing the quality of education, right? We want to make sure that this is the best possible outcome. So it's going to take some time. We want to make sure we get it right. So starting that sort of working together, which happens in a number of communities across Ontario, but it is the exception. It is not the rule. Right, the TDCSB, the Toronto Catholic District School Board, as well as the public school board, they just opened a new school that was half Catholic, half public, and also a community center. That's a great example of them working together. But again, that's the exception. That is not the rule.
And there are others across the province like that.
Yeah.
But you're right, it is more the exception. It's rationalizing space where you have a school that only has students that would fill half of it in the public and only half in the Catholic. Bring them together. You have better utilization of space. And
absolutely. But there are examples of people telling me already, just in the last year, where the Catholic board or the public board refuses to share space with the other board, where the Catholic board can't find enough qualified teachers. And so instead they are hiring unqualified teachers who happen to be Catholic, which I don't think is what we're looking for. We want, obviously, the best level of education. We want to make sure that everyone's qualified to teach our children.
I'm going to shift just slightly. let's talk about the economy, Ontario's economy.
Yeah.
It's been doing fairly well over the last couple of years.
Yeah.
There are potential storm clouds on the horizon, as there always are. How do you see a Liberal-led government by yourself addressing Ontario's future needs and addressing the economy?
Well, we talk a lot about how, we're going to try to future-proof the economy as much as we can, but we don't know what's coming. We do know certain things that are happening. We do know that most people my age, most millennials, people under 40, are likely going to have 3 to 5 careers over their lifetime. So on one front, we need to address the education issue. We need to make sure that we're providing opportunities for all adults to have lifelong learning, to reskill and retrain, and anticipate the changes in the economy. At the same time, we have to acknowledge the fact that not everyone can do that. That the number one job in Canada for a man right now is truck driver. You're not going to necessarily be able to convert all the truck drivers who lose their job when automation comes into computer programmers, right? As much as we'd like that to happen. So what do we need to create? What do we need to make sure happens here in this province? And what keeps coming up over and over again is the idea of basic income. We were talking about it as a poverty issue before, but now it sort of has the opportunity to help the province succeed on an economic level. Because what a basic income does is it creates an income floor that prevents people from falling through, that helps them keep their homes, helps them pay for food, right? That's it. It's basic. If you think about $1,400 a month being the only thing that you had to live on, you couldn't do very much on that, right? Especially in certain parts of this province. So what this does is that as people are transitioning from jobs or they're thinking about what they want to do next, it gives them the freedom to make the right choice, to think about whether or not they want to go back to school and study and to reskill, to think about whether or not they want to start their own business, to think about what type of job they might be able to work in. Because one of the examples that we heard from in the study here in Ontario were that people took that additional income as a way to better themselves, right? That a number of them, 70% of people who are on a basic income, who were on the pilot, were working. They just couldn't work enough. Right? It didn't matter that they worked full time. They couldn't make enough money to make ends meet. And so they were stuck in certain dead-end jobs and they weren't going to do any better. But the basic income allowed them to focus on one thing if they wanted to, and to give them that opportunity to make even more money and get out of the system. So all the models are showing that the economic impact of a basic income in Ontario would be over $10 billion in terms of adding to the economy and growing jobs. So this is why I think this is such an important thing.
So historically, Ontario's been known as the manufacturing heartland of Canada.
Right.
And those jobs, as we've seen in the automotive industry, are starting to disappear. Some of the manufacturing has left and gone offshore. What type of economic policy would you be pushing as possible Premier of Ontario?
So there's a couple of things there. First of all, I spent 4.5 years working at Sheridan College for the president there as the Director of Government Relations and Community Partnerships. We did a lot of those. We worked with companies like Siemens, ABB Robotics, Ford, to automate those jobs with our students. Right, so the students would be going through and learning how to use the robots and how to program them. But essentially, what we were doing is that we were creating jobs for dozens of students to graduate with and to work in those places. But to replace hundreds of jobs. Right. So how do you replace hundreds of jobs with dozens and then expect to be doing better on the other end?
And there is the question.
It's not just about making sure we're doing that, because it is important to do that. But what do you do with everybody else? How do you continue to grow the economy? Well, I think there's a big opportunity here with green energy and clean technology. because we talk a lot about oil and gas in this country, right? Like you hear it all the time on the news. Alberta needs this and that. One of the incredible things that I learned recently was that there are, and I had to look it up, I had to double check because I couldn't believe it. There are more green energy jobs, people working in solar and hydro and wind, more green energy jobs in Canada than oil and gas jobs in Canada. That's unbelievable.
This is something that one of your former bosses was a big advocate.
Yeah, Glenn Murray was a big advocate on this.
He's now working at the Pembina Institute in Alberta.
And that fighting climate change isn't a burden. It's an opportunity, right? I drove here today in my Chrysler Pacifica, which is a plug-in hybrid vehicle built right here in Ontario.
In Windsor.
Yep.
Which I have a Pacifica, so I know.
No, it's great. And our government worked with Fiat Chrysler several years ago for them to refurbish their plant. And they invested over $28 million, I believe, into building the plug-in hybrid Pacifica there. They hired 4,500 people, or kept 4,500 people on the line, 3 shifts of 1,500, and over 2 years saw sales increase dramatically because we had the vehicle incentive, we had the home renovation grant, and we had the cap and trade program, which made it easier for them to do business. When Doug Ford came in and canceled all those programs, year-over-year sales in Ontario went down 70%.
Yeah, they plummeted.
70%. We're one of the only jurisdictions in the world where EV sales went down year over year. And Chrysler had to lay off 1,500 people.
It's a full shift.
It's a full shift because they can't justify keeping all those people employed to make these cars. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that we as Liberals need to do better is communicate to the rest of the province that fighting climate change is an opportunity. We can be the leaders in everything new that's coming out that has to be green, that has to be clean, right? From vehicles to energy to all the other innovations that we could come up with. So we need a government that's willing to invest in those things, right? We need a government that's willing to say, we know where the puck is going, and we're going to make sure that we're going to go there, right? Instead of being left behind.
So your focus will be more on, more on a green economy.
Absolutely. I mean, first as the basis, we need a basic income to make sure people don't fall through the floor, to help with the changing economy coming forward. Second, we need to look at where are opportunities for Ontario to succeed. The reason we have an opportunity to succeed in the green economy is because we have a well-educated society, a well-educated province. Because of that, we can take that skills, we can take that sort of unique mix of Ontario and sell it to the world, right? We can be the center of that. That's within our grasp.
So your previous boss, Glenn Murray, and before him, George Smitherman, who was minister, brought, was it not Hyundai, but trying to think, one of the South Asian energy companies to create jobs here in Ontario.
Yeah.
And that went south on us. The jobs, the business, the money went offshore, but Ontario didn't succeed in that. How would you
Well, I think you
that?
want to have homegrown, you want to have some homegrown solutions, right? And you also need to make sure, especially when we're talking about the energy sector, you also need to make sure that there's community buy-in. Right, there's a big difference between the green energy program that we had in the 2000s in southwestern Ontario, which turned off a few people, and you could see didn't result in good results in subsequent elections. And what I think people understand the needs are today, and how we can work better with community consultations. We should have never gotten to a point where we canceled gas plants. But the fact that we talked about it for 3 elections was more a testament to how effective the opposition was. Doug Ford now, in a year and a half, canceled the Hydro One program, a contract with the U.S., because of the words that came out of his mouth. And it cost us over $130 million. Canceled a wind farm in Prince Edward County, which cost $237 million. the collective cost of that, plus the, if you take the math that the Auditor General is going to take and say to replace this is over 50 years, the lifespan of the plant, it's going to be as much, if not significantly more, than what the gas plants were. Yet we're not hearing about it every day. We don't have an effective NDP opposition right now who's talking about this every day and making the Conservatives wear the wasting of this money. Not even just wasting the money, which is egregious all on its own, but the fact that it's supposed to be the future, right? It's supposed to be that investment. It's supposed to get us further ahead, right? And I think that's the most criminal part of that decision.
You mentioned the NDP and not being an effective opposition, yet Liberals have now 6 members. Possibly by the time we get to convention, we'll have 8 members.
Right.
Still short of having official party status. How do you see your role as the future leader rebuilding the party?
So, we can talk about the NDP really quickly because I think they haven't given enough people reason to vote for them. I think they have been in opposition for a long time, and their best chance to form government was the 2018 election. I was in a number of Francophone communities in Ontario talking about how my commitment is not just because of my kids, but my kids have been trying to help me work on my French. But Doug Ford didn't even think it was important to learn French because he was Premier of Ontario. But Andrea Horwath hasn't bothered to learn French in over 10 years being the leader of the NDP. They're going to be in opposition. We need to do better as an opposition to demonstrate what we would do instead, right? We need to demonstrate to the rest of Ontario that we've listened, we've learned from our mistakes of the past, we understand how not to repeat them, and that we're going to give reasons for them to vote for us. So we talk a lot about voter turnout in elections, and obviously seniors vote quite a bit, and the older you get, the more you vote. But we have an opportunity right now with people under 40 who are now the largest voting bloc. They outnumber the boomers. Millennials outnumber boomers right now, and will continue to into the future. They haven't fully formed their political ideology yet. They know what they believe in terms of their values. Generally speaking, they are much more concerned about climate change than previous generations were. Generally speaking, they are more invested in education because they have more education than any previous generation before them, but they also have more student debt. And generally speaking, they're concerned about the future economy because they understand how quickly things are happening. So we need to give them a reason to vote for us. And it needs to be more than the traditional political reasons that we've been giving people. Oh, we're the centrist party, we're going to be the most reasonable, this, that, and the other thing. We need to show them that we're listening to what they've been saying and that the polls are saying 75% of Canadians support a basic income. 71% of Ontarians support merging the Catholic and non-Catholic school boards. We think this is the third rail. It's not. It's where people believe that we should be. So we need a leader, and we need to be a party that is willing to take bold positions like that will give people a reason to vote for us. And I think I represent that. I think I represent the desire for younger people in this province to take some responsibility now over what's happening because they've seen it happen to them for so long. And it's up to us to finally step up and say, that's no longer acceptable. I'm going to do something about that.
So what went wrong in the last election? If you're saying that what's needed is bold policies and be able to articulate a vision, where did the last election fail to do that?
I think we got very isolated as a party, and maybe not even just a party. I think the leadership of the party got very disconnected from everybody else. And it was, I don't blame any one person. I certainly don't blame the leaders that we've had. I think it's a matter of the party sort of accepting that, we're in power, we'll be okay. Let's just keep going and do what we need to do to win. And I don't think that was enough for most Ontarians who said, you're not listening. You're not hearing me when I tell you that it's more than just what's in my pocketbook, that we don't like the direction, or we don't like the tone. And a lot of it came across as we know better than everybody else. But we also started serving or putting forward things that made it sound like we were only addressing people who would support us, right? I think we stopped looking at ideas that would help all Ontarians, or at least we didn't sell it that way, right? We talked about the minimum wage as kind of a way to say that we were defending the people who make a minimum wage. But at the same time, we came across as attacking people who were paying a minimum wage, right? We vilified them as not being decent enough to pay people a living wage, right? Whereas I think there's an opportunity to talk about all our programs as an economic benefit to the entire province. To say, listen, we have a chance to increase the purchasing power of 2.5 million people who make a minimum wage. And that would be over $1 billion or whatever it is a year, right? They're going to spend more money at your business, because when you give people who don't have any money a little bit more money, they spend it because they don't have any money to save, right? This is the economic impact of that. And so we need to make sure that we're always reflecting that. And we need to make sure that there is a feedback loop, that there is a way for people to participate in our party and in our democratic process, because it is still exclusive, right? You've been a party member for a long time. You know how it works. And I was at the delegated convention last time when we elected Kathleen Wynne. Mm-hmm. It's a phenomenal experience. It's a very exclusive one, right? Only 2,000 people, 2,500 people are going to get to decide who the next leader of the party is. Yes, all the members got to vote for who that person was or who their delegates are going to be. But that only affects the first ballot. After that, those delegates can vote for whomever they want. And to be honest, there are only 40,000 members. There are 14 million Ontarians, right? So how do we expand that? How do we grow the party? How do we let more people feel like they can be part of this club?
Okay, you asked your own question. I'll let you answer it then. How do we open up the party and make it more universal?
Well, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think we've already seen this example in the federal party. The federal Liberals, after 3 consecutive losses in the federal election, where they found themselves in a position where they weren't even sure they were going to stay on as a party after that, they had that existential crisis, changed a number of things. The three biggest things they changed was they changed from a delegated convention to one member, one vote, so that every individual member of the party could vote directly for whom the leader should be and in what order they would prefer them to be. The second thing was they made that vote accessible in the sense that it was online, that they could vote. I voted from my phone for Justin Trudeau when he was running for leader in 2013. And the last one was they had a supporter class of membership, free membership, so that there was no financial barrier to being a part of the party. Those 3 things all were on the floor at the last AGM for the Ontario Liberal Party. They all had over 50% support. One member, one vote got 58% support. But it wasn't enough to change the Constitution, which needed a two-thirds majority.
So it needs 66.
Yeah. So the same thing happened federally, where it took a couple of tries before these things happened. But we're the last party, provincially or federally, that still has delegated convention. And
But you see what happens with the Ontario Conservatives and resulted in Doug Ford. You saw what happened with the federal Conservatives. It ended up with Andrew Scheer when they all went to one of these
one member, one vote,
exactly. Or a hybrid of that system. But you could end up also with somewhat skewed results.
Well, I mean, I think Doug's an interesting case, but at the same time, it's a system that Justin Trudeau won in, and that we have other examples of across the country. I think you want to reflect people's wishes, right? What do the membership actually want out of their leadership candidates, and who can be the leader of the party? When people talk about the benefits of a convention, having that deliberative choice, we can replicate that. So you don't have to necessarily have a preferential ballot where you rank everybody 1, 2, 3, 4. You could have a vote on Friday at noon till midnight on Friday for the first ballot, and then understand how it changes, and essentially have a virtual convention, but have everybody being able to vote, and then everybody could vote again. There's lots of things we could do. We could understand the idea
Conservatives actually tried that once federally. Didn't work very well for them.
We could also have, a primary model where we would elect or have people vote in certain regions of the province first. I think it'd be interesting if we went in reverse order, from where we did most successfully or least successful in the previous election to the most successful in the previous election. I think that would allow us to focus on certain regions and give proposals to gain their support. So what I'm saying is that it should be fluid. I don't think it should be written in stone. And we should understand what the challenges are of the existing system and what we would need to do to make the system better, to have people have more faith in the system itself. And so I think it's a good segue to electoral reform, because it's come out recently where Fair Vote was talking about what we would need to do or what should we do, and they want proportional representation and they want a citizens' assembly, and I'm not opposed to those things. But if you are actually an advocate for electoral reform anywhere in this country, you know that we've had multiple citizen assemblies in multiple provinces. We've had multiple referendums in multiple provinces, and none of them have passed in the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason is that there isn't political buy-in. So my suggestion is that we as a party, and we encourage other parties to say what their plans for electoral reform would be, and then run on an election. Our election would have, I think, we would want a preferential ballot. I think we might want to introduce some level of proportionality. But let's have the party agree that this is what we want, or that this is what we think is a better method. And then go to the electorate in a regular election and say that we would implement this if we were elected. And that way we have the mandate to do it, and not a sort of wishy-washy idea of this will be the last first past the post election. I think we have a concrete proposal, have people vote on your party and whether or not your party should be able to implement that proposal, and then give them a chance in the subsequent election, so 2 elections later, to maintain the system or to revert back to the previous system like they do in New Zealand, right? They have a referendum 2 elections later to decide whether or not to keep it or not. So then you've understood how the system works the way it is.
Now let me shift again just slightly, stay with the political side of things. And the Ontario Liberal Party has significant debt. It's somewhere in the magnitude over $6 million. The funding from the province is being reduced and eliminated under Doug Ford. How are you going to address that?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Marcel. I think we need people to be engaged and involved in politics. And I think giving them things to be excited about are reasons for them to donate and to support the party. But more importantly, we need to be much better organized. We need to be digital first, because we are far, far behind the other parties in terms of having that database and having that access to people. Early in our campaign, we had a very strong online presence where we had an ad campaign on social media. We reached a unique audience of 685,000 Ontarians, which is almost 2/3 of everyone who voted for the Ontario Liberal Party in the last election. Having that audience is key. Being able to interact with them and identify them and further expand our knowledge of where they live and who they are, and so we can call them for donations, put up signs, become volunteers, all that. What do we need to do as a party? That's our feedback loop. On top of that, if we had the other party changes that I proposed of getting people involved, we could have more members. When Justin Trudeau ran for leader in 2013, the Ontario wing of the party had 200,000 federal members with supporter class membership. We have 40,000 right now who are paying $20 each. So they had 5 times more the members they had to elect their leader in the same province. So I want to make sure that we're expanding our membership base by giving them the opportunity to come in, so that we can then use them, work with them, and fundraise through them and understand what their needs are as citizens and as party members.
But we haven't been very successful on the fundraising side of things. How would you change
Well, this is what I'm
that?
saying is that let's expand the pool, right? Right now we have a pool of 40,000 members that we keep gouging $500 for coming to the convention. You know, they're getting countless emails from all the leadership candidates.
I get them all.
So let's expand the pool of our potential support, right? And let's give them a reason to not just vote for us, but also to contribute. We have to change the culture. We have to make sure that we're always engaged on every platform and every social media platform that's around, because in 2018 we were not. There were gaps between the 2014 and the 2018 election that I spoke with Michael Chan with a lot about how on WeChat and Chinese social media they were talking about the most vile things about Premier Win, and we let it slide because we didn't think it was dignified to respond to it, and we didn't need to, and that we could address it when the election came around. That's not true. We lost that support because we weren't engaging in those conversations. So we need to have that presence digitally. I think 40 or 50% of Ontarians now get their news primarily through social media. And we need to give them the avenue through those mediums to support the party, become a member of the party, fundraise, and donate to the party, right? It's all about expanding the pool. So instead of taxing the 40,000 members that we have, which always goes down to, 10 to 15 in between elections, let's have a larger pool of hundreds of thousands of people that we can talk to.
Interesting. Well, Alvin, I want to thank you for stopping by and sharing some of your thoughts in terms of your aspiration to be the next leader and future Premier of Ontario. So thank you again for coming by.
Thanks so much, Marcel. It was a pleasure.